Okay, guys, so lecture two here, which I'll keep as brief as I can so that you're not brain dead, um, about Oedipus the King. Obviously, the most shocking aspect about the ending of Oedipus is he gouges out his eyes. It's known as oculonucleosis or something like that. I guess it does happen or something. I doubt it happens too often, but it's a very obviously one of the most famous sort of scenes in literature. You really can't have any, honestly, any image you see in movies or literature where somebody loses their eyes. It's always a reference to Oedipus in some ways. Like if you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, one of the great, great movies of Hollywood, where Faye Dunaway in the end is shot from behind and it blasts through her eye. It's a clear reference to Oedipus the King, given that in the movie she's a victim of incest and she's trying to rescue her daughter, who's a product of that incest from the horrible wealthy guy who's after her to cover up the his the horror that he committed. Um, Anyhow, so that's where Oedipus gouges out his eyes at the end and comes fleeing from the temple, screaming in pain. And it's always depicted with bandages around the actor with bloody red sort of stains for the eyes. It obviously is a traumatizing kind of moment. And you see that with the chorus crying out, "Why have you done this, Oedipus? What led you to such a horrible, horrible act? What made you do this?" And of course, that becomes kind of I wouldn't call it so much a mystery, although it is a bit of a mystery, but a puzzle, we'll say, for us, the audience, for us, the readers. Why does Oedipus do this? Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can investigate this, and easily you could write a response about this. And a couple of you did sort of tackle it in your journal entries. People have written papers, people have written books about, Oedipus blinding himself. So I'll just go through the ones that just sort of pop up all the time. The first one, obviously, would be symbolic. Think about it this way. Look at how blindness and sight have been motifs that run throughout the play, right? Lots of images of blindness and sight. Beginning, of course, the big parallel scene is Tiresias, who is a blind seer, a blind prophet. And the irony is not lost there, right? Tiresias cannot see physically, but he can see metaphysically. He can see truths that are not physical. Whereas Oedipus, who's got sight, who's a very physical guy, can see perfectly well, and yet he's so blind to who he is, which is something Tiresias does not forget to emphasize to Oedipus. You who can see so well are so dumb to your own condition. So what happens at the end? The roles are reversed. Oedipus now is blind. And kind of the idea is maybe now in his abject blind condition, he'll be able to see truths that are not apparent in the physical world. So you can think of that metaphor, and it's very much a metaphor of being able to see yet being so blind, and being blind and yet being able to see. And so much of it comes from the question, where does truth come from? Where does knowledge arise, right? One can think in a kind of modern sense, if we want to connect it to who we are today, that yes, truths can be something that we see out here in the world, right? We can see things in the sensible world, but in a modern sense, we know that bigger truths come from inwardness, from inside, from the invisible, from things we can't see. For instance, things of the self. Self-knowledge comes from inside. Or, of course, one wants to think on a religious level or the level of the divine. The divine is never something visible, it's a state of the invisible. So, the most important aspect of what it means to be human for many is the transcendent or the divine. And for the Greeks, that's the realm of the ideas, the realm of that what's beyond the sense of the world. And therefore, that becomes the thing you can't see with physical eyes. You can only see philosophically, so to speak. And I want to point out, think of the connections here with Plato's allegory of a cave. right? Remember that right, a few weeks ago? Plato's allegory of a cave, where, the whole allegory is about how the sensible world, the world of our senses, we can't trust. That philosophy needs to go beyond that, to the metaphysics, to that that's beyond the physical, to the spiritual, or to for the Greeks, the world of the ideas, the conceptual world. And when we get to Christianity next week, the realm of the transcendent, or God, the divine realm, the realm of spirit. Um, so it plays into that notion. But what else might blinding himself mean? Well, certainly think of it this way too. Oedipus is also a smart guy. He's not unaware of the fact that, Tiresias one-upped me. he had the goods. I didn't. And he couldn't see and I could. So there's an element of what we call ironic punishment here. He punishes himself by blinding himself. We call it the ironic punishment, most famous in Dante's Inferno, where everybody in the Inferno is being in hell. They're being punished by either by getting punishments that ironically are fitting to who they are. For instance, if somebody's sin is gluttony, well, they might be punished by having to eat forever and ever and ever for infinity or something like that. But anyhow, or if you were suffering from pride in Dante's Inferno, well, in hell you constantly know the truth and you're proclaiming it over and over again, but nobody's listening to you. So for infinity, you're proclaiming truths and nobody gives a crap. So an ironic punishment of sorts for Oedipus. But I would suggest there's also another possibility too. When Oedipus comes out, screaming in pain, about his condition, and he's blinded, and the chorus is yelling, "What led you to do something like this? How could you do something so horrible? Why blind to yourself?" Oedipus does respond. He gives an answer. He says to them, and if you look at it, he's kind of clear. He says, "Apollo. It was always Apollo. Apollo was always running the show." Remember we talked about Apollo versus Dionysus? Apollo was always laying down the law. He's the one who fated my life to be cursed like this. He's the one who is constantly, forcing me towards this horrible fate. But then Oedipus goes, "But I, by my own free will, I took that brooch and gouged out my eyes. Not Apollo. I wasn't compelled to this. I did it because I wanted to." And so in some ways, Oedipus is pridefully kind of going like this to the gods. Sorry, but it is kind of like that. It's like a finger to the gods. Like, screw you, Apollo. I've got my own fate in my hands. You bet you didn't see that coming. He kind of what he's saying here. And then there's also just the fact that Oedipus is dragging himself down to the most abject that he can possibly be in some ways. And even Creon says, you'll notice towards the end, when the guards all want to grab him and like toss him in a dungeon or something, and Creon says, "No, nobody touch him. Not only is he taboo, but he's a holy thing." And kind of the idea of the Greeks is when you reach such a low point, you become kind of sacred, holy in a sense. And don't forget, sacred means set aside. So sacred, it's religious as a term, but it doesn't necessarily mean like moral. It means something that's it's the sacred is something that's so either spiritual or so horrible or so filled with the mystery or whatever it might be that it's untouchable. It's set over aside. Literally, if you look up sacred, the etymology of it in a dictionary, it literally means to put something aside or to keep something secret or to keep something in an elevated and special place. And that's kind of what happens to Oedipus. Now, if you read, not saying you will, but I recommend it, it's a trilogy, believe it or not, Oedipus the King. There is a second play and a third one. And in the second play, you see it's about Antigone, his daughter, and Creon becomes another tyrant, a horrible, arrogant guy, and is refusing to give the big tension play is Creon refuses to give a proper burial to Antigone's husband. You can see it result, but Oedipus is this kind of abject figure by himself, living out in the caves. And Antigone makes the daring taboo move to go seek him out. And then Oedipus Eclanus is the third play, and literally at the end of the play, Oedipus gains a kind of holy apotheosis, of who he is. And so you do get this trend in mythology and in representation, and you'll see it with Jesus Christ too, of the most emptied out, the most pitiful being ends up being the most powerful in some ways. Don't forget, when we get to Jesus, Jesus is only powerful when he's the least powerful, when he's nailed to a cross, when he has no friends, when he's an abandoned, nothing of a human being mocked while he's dying, is when he gains his most power. And this becomes a really interesting motif throughout literature, that oftentimes what you get are the most powerful figures are actually the weakest ones. And where the most power comes from is from what's known as the kenosis, the emptied out individual or being, and you get motifs of that. And I would argue that Jesus is the most extreme version of it, a God who becomes purely human. And not only that, but purely, brought down to the weakest, most tortured image you could possibly get, crucifixion. And yet from that weakened body grows then the mightiness of the Spirit, the mightiness of the Holy Spirit, and the basis of, the most powerful religion that forms in the world, Christianity. And I don't know if you've seen, there's a lot of these religious motifs that do repeat throughout the ancient world leading up to Christianity and beyond then up until today. It's known as archetypal criticism when you look at these developing motifs. And certainly you see motifs of resurrection, the death of Dionysus, who rises again in the spring, with the seasons. But you also get somebody like Oedipus who must sacrifice himself to save the kingdom. What does Jesus do? He has to sacrifice himself to save the world, right? Ransom himself for the sins of mankind. So these are kind of motifs that you see that bear fruit and then continue throughout, throughout history in many ways. I don't know where they're going to go from here. It's an interesting issue, but many people like me, and I would agree with this, Jesus Christ becomes the apotheosis of this motif because he's the ultimate, being a human body as the sacrificial lamb. He becomes the ultimate annulment of violence as the form of salvation. All the ancient world tends to use sacrificial violence. Christ overcomes that by becoming a weak body that then, I'm not speaking this very well, but becomes then the Christ, the Messiah. So anyhow, I hope this helps you. So the next video I'll make, what I'll do is what I wanted to do in class, and that's to discuss the next cultural period, the ancient Roman Empire, with you all, and to talk a little bit about the beginnings of Christianity that evolves from that massive Roman Empire. So just be patient. It takes a little while for these videos to render. Thanks.